He will be joined by Conrad Sauvé, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Red Cross, Jerry Rankin, Chief Executive Officer of St. John's Ambulance, Lieutenant Colonel John Murray, Secretary for Communications at the Salvation Army, and Janelle Coultes, President of Search and Rescue Volunteer Association of Canada. Il sera accompagné par Conrad Sauvé, le président et président-directeur général de la Croix-Rouge canadienne, Jerry Rankin, le président-directeur général de l'Ambulance Saint-Jean, le lieutenant-colonel John Murray, le secrétaire des communications de l'Armée de Salut, et Janelle Coultes, la présidente de l'Association canadienne des volontaires en recherche et sauvetage. To give you an idea of how today's event will unfold, we'll hear brief remarks from the minister, then our guests will follow. Pour vous donner un aperçu du déroulement, nous entendrons des brèves allocutions du ministre puis nos invités après. So without further ado, please welcome me in joining the Honorable Bill Blair, President of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada and Minister of Emergency Preparedness, to say a few words. Minister Blair.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. Bon après-midi tout le monde. Good afternoon, everyone. And before we begin, I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge that I am joining you today from the traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples. And as Tim mentioned, I'd like to take the opportunity as well to recognize Conrad Sauvé, the President and CEO of the Canadian Red Cross, Lieutenant Colonel John Murray from the Salvation Army, Jerry Rankin and Michael Dodd from St. John's Ambulance, and Janelle Coultes, Presidents of Search and Rescue Volunteer Association of Canada, who are all joining us here today for this announcement. The importance of these organizations and the individuals who lead them cannot be overstated. Every day, 24/7 and around the clock, often at a moment's notice, they bring relief and assistance to people who are experiencing the most challenging moments of their lives. Many serve on the front lines of disaster, and those they help are in danger and at great risk of losing their livelihood, their land, their homes, and access to essential services. Their organizations give each of us a place to turn when tragedy strikes. And the four organizations and the leaders that I'm joined by today represent what I believe to be the very best of our country's spirit. Canadians stepping up to serve and support their neighbors. The tragic floods and wildfires that we've seen in recent days are poignant reminders of the need for their essential services. They have helped Canadians to rebuild their lives. Even entire communities have disappeared, ravaged by wildfires and by flood. This week marks Emergency Preparedness Week. And as we begin our response efforts to support flood-impacted communities and prepare for the upcoming wildfire season, we are reminded of the importance of remaining vigilant and engaged. And certainly the past 2 years have shown us how large-scale emergency events like the pandemic can quickly overwhelm existing resources. The Government of Canada continues to make every effort to be there for the provinces and territories, ensuring that the necessary capacity is in place to respond to all requests for federal assistance. And an important part of that is supporting non-government organizations, or NGOs, involved in responding to these events, including frequent climate change-related disasters in Canada. And that is why today I'm very pleased to announce funding for these four NGOs under the Supporting Humanitarian Workforce to respond to COVID-19 and other large-scale emergencies programs. This program provides $150 million over a 2-year period to support both capacity building and domestic deployment to Canadian emergency management NGOs. To date, the government has provided more than $78 million in capacity building for NGOs. They include the Canadian Red Cross, St. John's Ambulance, the Salvation Army, and the Search and Rescue Volunteer Association of Canada. And this funding, in its initial year, has had a major impact. These emergency management organizations have been better able to mobilize in response to emerging events, supporting provincial, territorial, and local governments. And it has meant that for example, that long-term care facilities, those providing public health support, and those responding to national disasters have had the assistance that they require when they need it most. And over the next year, the program will continue to provide funding for these organizations. And I believe this funding will help them to continue to build capacity, to respond and to deploy as required, and to fund deployments in response to specific requests for federal assistance as they may arise. It will help them maintain their incredible rosters of first responders with a variety of skill sets. And it will help develop systems and training to acquire equipment for rapid mobilization. And I am confident through this substantial funding, we will continue to make a difference in providing relief to Canadians in their time of greatest need. As the Minister of Emergency Preparedness, I want to emphasize that we'll always work closely with all of our partners to address the needs of those hit hardest, no matter the emergency. The Government of Canada is proud to support these trusted and reliable organizations. They're extraordinary partners, and we're very, very grateful for their leadership and their hard work on behalf of all Canadians. In any emergency situation, they have always been among the first to lend a helping hand to people in need. And I want to take this opportunity to express my deepest gratitude and appreciation for all that they do and continue to do for us each and every day. I know that with their ongoing efforts, we will continue to do everything we can to keep Canadians healthy and safe. Thank you very much, Tim, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Minister Blair. Mr. Sauvé, over to you.
Thank you, Minister Blair. Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. I'm very pleased to join you today. Mon nom est Conrad Sauvé. Je suis le président de la Croix-Rouge canadienne, and I'm joining you from Ottawa, which is on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Canadian Red Cross is tremendously proud of our engagement in the humanitarian workforce over the past 2 years. Thanks to the investment from the Government of Canada, we were able to launch and support the largest response in the history of the Canadian Red Cross. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have marked many milestones. This includes recruiting and training more than 5,000 personnel to respond to more than 100 requests for assistance from across the country. The pandemic has brought many challenges to our communities, and when local resources have been overwhelmed, the Red Cross has been there to support and work alongside everyone who has answered the call to help. Depuis les débuts de la pandémie, nos communautés locales ont dû surmonter de nombreux défis, et lorsque les ressources locales étaient débordées, la Croix-Rouge était présente pour offrir son soutien et sa collaboration à toutes les parties prenantes qui ont répondu à l'appel à l'aide. Over the past 2 years, we have supported more than 20,000 people in isolation and quarantine sites. We have administered more than 86,000 COVID-19 vaccines, including in remote and Indigenous communities. And that's just a snapshot of the work of the Red Cross as part of the humanitarian workforce initiatives. And work continues today. As we begin to slowly shift to our new normal in Canada, in what we hope is soon a post-pandemic world, the next crisis is already upon us. In fact, the climate crisis was here before COVID and continues to drive the rising frequency and severity of disasters impacting Canadians. Spring flooding is once again threatening many communities across the country. And as we speak, the Red Cross is responding in Manitoba in support of Peguis First Nations, where more than 1,000 people have been evacuated from their homes. And more people will be affected in the coming days. This is just the beginning of flood season. Forest fire season will come soon after that. And each year, as the minister mentioned, with increasing frequency and severity, we're seeing the growing impact of climate change on Canadian communities. We witnessed this last summer as communities in British Columbia were devastated by both fires and flood events. Canadians contribute their time, donations, and compassion to supporting their neighbors in their time of need. That humanity, combined with the commitment from the Government of Canada, as expressed by Minister Blair today, continues to ensure that the Red Cross is here for people in their hour of need. Il est essentiel de maintenir une force humanitaire prête à agir et nous nous réjouissons donc des investissements continus du gouvernement du Canada. Maintaining a strong humanitarian workforce is critical, and we are grateful to the Government of Canada for their continued investment. Together, we can help mitigate the impacts of emergencies by increasing our collective readiness to respond in a moment's notice. Merci. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Sauvé. Mr. Rankin, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land from which I'm speaking is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. St. John Ambulance has a long history of responding to large-scale emergencies, whether it is wildfires in British Columbia and Alberta, flooding in British Columbia, Eastern Ontario, and Western Quebec, for assistance in so many ways during the COVID pandemic. Our volunteers are trained in advanced first aid and emergency management and readily respond to provide assistance in both short and long-term deployments. And our therapy dog teams provide psychosocial support to victims of crises. We are very pleased to be part of this humanitarian workforce program, along with our fellow NGOs. We know that working together, we will be a strong and skilled resource which can be called upon in times of need. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rankin. I'd like to now invite Lieutenant Colonel Murray to speak.
Thank you, Tim. Minister Blair, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Lieutenant Colonel John Murray, and I'm pleased this afternoon to speak on behalf of the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army's territorial headquarters in Toronto is located on Treaty 13 land, the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. When two ships collided in Halifax Harbor more than 100 years ago, the Salvation Army sprang into action, sending personnel from across the country to help. The Halifax explosion was indeed our first coordinated emergency response in Canada. During forest fires, catastrophic floods, tornadoes and ice storms, and disasters of all shapes and sizes, from natural hazards to human-made, the Salvation Army has been there and continues to be there for Canadians when they need us most. We can be there, I think, ready for anything because of the dedication of our emergency disaster personnel and volunteers, because of the incredible generosity of our partners, our sponsors and donors, and in no small part, Minister, because of the commitment of the Government of Canada and funding initiatives like the Humanitarian Workforce Program. Volunteers are indeed the lifeline of our emergency disaster response program, and we have more than 2,500 trained volunteers who can quickly respond when called upon. When British Columbia's catastrophic floods cut communities off from access to food and essential services, literally forcing thousands to flee their homes, we were there. We delivered meals, sometimes by helicopter, provided shelter, and offered emotional and spiritual care to people who had lost everything. And we're grateful for the Humanitarian Workforce Program and making so much of that possible. From deployment kits packed with PPE to keep our EDS volunteers and workers safe, to training kits that will allow us to train even more personnel from coast to coast to coast. We're thankful for the support of the Government of Canada in helping us respond with what is needed when it is needed most. Minister, we're honored to partner with the Government of Canada and our agencies, partner agencies here today, the Red Cross, St. John's Ambulance, Search and Rescue Volunteer Association of Canada, and others as we work together to meet the urgent needs of Canadians in crisis. And together we spread hope that things will get better. And the Salvation Army promises we will be there to make sure that things do get better as we're part of the social fabric of the 400 Canadian communities where we serve. On behalf of the Salvation Army this afternoon and all those we serve, thank you for your ongoing support and commitment to helping us serve efficiently and effectively, responding to Canadians during times of crisis. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Lieutenant Murray. And I'd like to pass the mic off to Ms. Coultes.
Thank you very much, Minister Blair, for the opportunity to speak today. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janelle Coultes, and as President of the Search and Rescue Volunteer Association of Canada, it is my pleasure to have the opportunity to represent Canada's volunteer search and rescue community as we recognize Emergency Preparedness Week. SARVAC is an association that represents almost 10,000 volunteer ground search and rescue professionals. We have approximately 300 teams supported by associations in every province and territory of the country. Our members are on call 24 hours per day, 365 days per year, to be ready to serve our communities at a moment's notice in times of need. Our volunteers are uniquely qualified for assisting with humanitarian emergencies, transferring our search and rescue skills to adapt to any event or disaster that we are called to respond to. Our recent deployment to Deer Lake First Nation was a prime example of this, and SARVAC was honored to be able to assist one of our nation's communities in a time of need. In addition to always being ready to respond to calls for missing persons, our ground search and rescue volunteers have been responding to disaster events in our communities for decades. It is an aspect of our organization that we are very proud of. SARVAC also places a high priority on prevention, and we are looking forward to continuing this through the Humanitarian Workforce Program. We are fortunate that our federal government has recognized these efforts and has created the Humanitarian Workforce Program to provide financial support for organizations such as ours. This allows SARVAC to build our capabilities and augment our capacity to respond to these emergency events. Along with our colleagues in the volunteer community, such as the Salvation Army, St. John Ambulance, and the Canadian Red Cross, I would like to thank Minister Blair for creating this program and supporting the passion of thousands of volunteers that work tirelessly to support our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Coultes. Now we'll move to the Q&A session. To give everyone an opportunity to participate, please limit yourself to one question and one follow-up. Please begin your question by identifying yourself and naming the media outlet you present. Afin de donner la chance à tout le monde de participer, veuillez-vous limiter à une question et un suivi. Veuillez commencer votre question en vous identifiant et nommant l'organisme de presse que vous représentez.
Thank you. Merci. We will now take questions from the telephone lines. If you have a question and you're using a speakerphone, please lift your handset before making your selection. If you have a question, please press *1 on your device's keypad. Nous allons maintenant passer à la période de questions. Si vous avez un téléphone main libre, s'il vous plaît, soulevez le combiné avant d'effectuer votre sélection. Si vous désirez poser une question, veuillez s'il vous plaît appuyer sur les touches étoile 1 de votre appareil. There will be a brief pause while the participants register. Il y aura un court délai vous permettant de vous enregistrer. The first question is from Dylan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Hi, Minister Blair. I'm just asking the latest on the Peguis First Nations request for assistance, if you've received a request from Indigenous Services Canada yet.
Well, actually, thank you very much for the question, Don. I will tell you, I had a meeting yesterday with Minister Haidu and the people from Indigenous Services. I've also had conversations with Minister Puniak from Manitoba, and I know Minister Haidu has spoken to her counterpart in the Manitoba government. And of course, we are in regular contact with the Indigenous leadership of the Peguis community. We have not at this moment in time received a formal request for assistance, but that doesn't mean assistance isn't being delivered. And I can advise that Indigenous Services is on the ground and in constant and regular contact. And as my friend Conrad Sauvé mentioned, the Red Cross has been in that community and deployed in that community and providing services right from the outset. And so there is very close collaboration going on between the community itself and Indigenous Services Canada, but as well between the federal government and the Manitoba government to provide the assistance that is required. And let me take the opportunity to acknowledge how grateful I am, how quickly the Red Cross responded. And although request for assistance is a rather formalized program in which provinces and territories can request assistance from the federal government, that is never seen as an impediment, particularly by our partners in the non-government organizations that provide services, such as the Red Cross, Salvation Army, SARVAC, or St. John's. They respond quickly, and because they are part of the community, they're in the community, and their response is something I think we have an opportunity to acknowledge today.
And just to follow up for Minister Blair and for Mr. Sauvé, I'm wondering if either of you have any concerns about how long it's taking on the military side. The chief told us he was pondering military aid 72 hours ago. It seems like the ball isn't rolling yet. There seems to be a jurisdictional communication issue. Does it concern either of you that you have a chief asking for the military and the actual process of deliberation hasn't even started yet?
Yeah, if I may begin, and then I'd certainly invite Mr. Sauvé to comment as well. But let me make the observation that, I think many people, and let me also begin with an acknowledgement. The Canadian Armed Forces have been extraordinary in their response. They have provided resources and their capabilities in so many communities across the country that have experienced flooding events. They've done sandbagging in the Northwest Territories, and last year in the British Columbia events, they were utilized very, very appropriately and necessarily to rescue people who were stranded on highways in British Columbia, for example. And so the Canadian Armed Forces are quite often a very important part of our response, but they're not our only response. And one of the things, in acknowledging the impact that responding to domestic service calls for natural events can be very challenging for the Canadian Armed Forces, and sometimes they're not the necessary and most appropriate way to respond. And it's one of the reasons that we've created the humanitarian workforce, and that we're working so collaboratively and closely in providing support and funding to our NGO partners, because those organizations are quite often exactly the right response. And I'll just give you an example. When we sent the Canadian Armed Forces into long-term care facilities in both Quebec and Ontario, they provided immediate and important relief, but we recognized that was not sustainable, and that was not the best response. And so we've worked very closely in that case with the Canadian Red Cross to bring in trained volunteers to take on duties that they performed exceptionally ably, that freed up the Canadian Armed Forces to go back to doing the important work that they do on behalf of all Canadians and keeping our country safe. And so I think that the making sure that the right response in a timely way is provided to these communities. I think many of us think as a default that we would always call upon the Canadian Armed Forces to respond to natural disaster. But we know, and as evidenced today in this news conference, there are a number of important NGOs that really facilitate Canadians helping Canadians, to making sure people are trained with the right resources and the right capabilities to go and do the jobs that need to be done. And that's, I believe, right now, and certainly we'll monitor very carefully what's going on in Peguis, but I want to acknowledge how important it is that the Red Cross has been there from the very beginning and is there now providing important services. Conrad, if anything else you wanted to comment, I'll stop talking and give it to you.
Well, I think you summed it up well, Minister. I think we're supporting at the time, I think over 1,300 people in terms of the evacuation, working closely with the Peguis First Nation, who's very well organized as well. So nothing more to add to that.
Sir.
All right, operator, we're ready to take the next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Once again, please press *1 on the device's keypad if you have a question. N'hésitez pas à faire étoile 1 pour toute question. The next question is from Lee Berthiaume from the Canadian Press. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Yes, thank you. This question is for Minister Blair, and kind of riffs a little bit off of Dylan's question about the military. We've heard repeatedly from military officials and leaders over the last couple of years about the pressures that they're facing in terms of both, preparing for overseas and domestic missions, while also being increasingly called upon for domestic responses, in particular with regards to natural disasters and the COVID pandemic and whatnot. And I'm wondering what you plan to do with this. Again, military leaders are warning that this increased pressure on them to respond, in particular to domestic crises, is straining their ability to prepare for missions overseas and prepare to defend Canada. So are there any measures or even a review or something like that planned by the government to address this issue?
Yes, Lee, in fact, my office and Minister Hernandez have been working very closely together. Let me acknowledge, sometimes the Canadian Armed Forces is exactly the response that we require. And I would point out to how effective the Ranger program has been in Canada's northern and remote communities. They're in the community, and their response and the services and support that they have provided to communities in the north who've been impacted by natural disasters and the pandemic has been extraordinary and absolutely essential to keeping people safe. The work that the Canadian Armed Forces did in British Columbia last year during the floods, getting people off the highway, sandbagging in certain locales, they saved homes, they saved communities. Their work has been essential and really and very effective. but we also recognize that there's the power of volunteers. And for every dollar we invest in these NGOs, they leverage those dollars through their volunteer program and the excellent training and leadership that they provide into creating great value, I think, for communities and for Canadians, so that people who are trained and appropriately equipped to respond to these emergencies. And it's a matter of really determining what's the right response and the most timely response that we can provide to assist Canadians in their time of greatest need, recognizing that, I think, the Canadian Armed Forces has done an extraordinary job and may require and does require additional, supports and resources in order to continue to be able to provide those services when needed. But it's also important that we do the hard work that we're all doing together and in all of the organizations that are represented on this call today in the development and creation of a humanitarian workforce that draws upon the extraordinary talent and commitment of volunteers right across this country. And these organizations that are represented here today provide a varied but important, I think, suite of responses to the types of natural disasters and emergencies that communities face. And so we're working with them to supplement and support. When the Canadian Armed Forces is the only resource that's available and the right resource, then they'll be deployed to do that job. But we know that there are many other ways to respond and far more effective ways to respond. I've had the privilege, and I was in crisis and emergency response as a police officer and a police chief for many years in the city of Toronto. I know all four of these organizations well, and I know that they have been there for us whenever we called upon them, whenever we needed them. They were there, and they brought a remarkable capacity and commitment to serving the Canadians. And so we're building upon that capacity and commitment by providing them with some financial support. And they are extraordinary partners, and we want to make sure that they're utilized as appropriately and as robustly as possible to serve Canadians in times of emergency.
You started out your answer by talking about your office, you and Minister Anand, I should say, are working on this. Can you specifically say what this is? Are you talking about additional supports and resources, or can you provide more detail? And I know I've also heard from military officials who worry that the military is increasingly being turned to not as the force of last resort, but it's the force of first resort, because they're always on standby, they're always ready to go. Do you think that there are times where they're being called inappropriately to respond and therefore exacerbating this issue that they're raising?
They've done such a great job for us over the years that I think many community leaders and even the provinces and territories, municipal leaders, think of the Canadian Armed Forces as their first, resort and resource to call upon in times of emergency. And part of the work that we have been doing over the past 2 years in funding and developing the humanitarian workforce to deal with, first of all, the pandemic and other natural disasters, I think that's essential work. And we want to take the opportunity to make sure that provinces, territories, municipal partners, Indigenous leadership, and Canadians right across the country know that there are other resources that are more appropriate and will be made available to them to provide support in times of emergency. I think it's important to acknowledge there are times when the Canadian Armed Forces is the right response, and we want to make sure that they're properly resourced and equipped and able to do that job on behalf of all Canadians. But at the same time, I think that we have worked hard over the past 2 years, working with our NGO partners that are here with us today, to develop a greater capacity for Canadians to serve in times of emergency, in times of their greatest need. And I want Canadians to be confident that when we respond, when a request for assistance comes to the federal government, and we respond with the expertise and the capacities of these NGOs to those situations, Canadians are getting the best response and the most timely and appropriate of help when they need it. Sometimes, the Canadian Armed Forces is not the right response, and as we've seen in a number of instances that I cited earlier, that when we send these NGOs and their experts and their volunteers into a community, they do the right job, and they do it in an exceptionally able and committed way.
Minister, if I may add to your comments to this question, I think one of the examples to the question here in terms of deployment is certainly during the COVID period. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we've deployed over 5,000 personnel, actually in support to long-term care, vaccination, and so on and so forth. So there's a number of areas where we're building up standing capacity to be able to respond. And I think we need to spend a little more time in seeing what's requested in these, what's the specifics of what required. and where does the armed forces added value? And I think one recent example, certainly the armed forces add value in logistical capacity. There's a number of things on the ground that could be performed by others. And again, the case of COVID were provided, among others, by organizations around the table, and certainly the Red Cross. In BC flood response recently, we deployed, we received support to transport cleanup kits that we distributed, that we had boots on the ground to distribute. So it's looking at what's required and who are the best to serve. And again, we're training military personnel for a specific role. And I'm just going along the lines, but again, during COVID, we replaced the military basically in long-term care facilities with people that were trained for that specific purpose on the social side, and did so quite well.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
There are no further questions registered. Il n'y a plus de questions en ce moment-ci. Thank you. The conference has now ended. Please disconnect your lines at this time. And we thank you for your participation. Merci. La conférence est maintenant terminée. Veuillez, s'il vous plaît, accrocher vos lignes. Et merci à tous les participants qui se sont joints.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to all my friends. I really appreciate you taking the time with us today. Look forward to working together.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.